Hey guys, Tim Starnes from Cinesamples. In the previous corrective EQ tutorial videos, I talked about the use of static EQ for correcting problem frequencies in percussion, brass, and string stems, individually and within a mix. In this tutorial, I move on to a new concept, compression. As with the previous videos, I am focusing on applying this concept within one particular mixing situation, MIDI production using sample libraries in the orchestral and film score genre. Many composers have asked me, how do I use compression? Do I need it? And which one is best? In the orchestral and film score genres, fortunately, compression isn't often needed. In fact, many times it doesn't sound good because the music is typically very dynamic, so compressors typically flatten out the music, taking away its life. So when you're bombarded with ads for compressor plugins, or you hear your colleagues talking about compression and how great it is, you can rest easy knowing 9 times out of 10, you won't miss it. So what exactly is happening during compression? What is compression? By definition, compression is gain reduction. It's the reduction of audio dynamic range. Audio dynamic range is the span between the softest and the loudest parts of a sound source. I'm going to explain it in a really oversimplified way, and I'm going to exclude the many technical exceptions, additions, and rules for the ease of understanding. Okay, this is a really old school way of showing you. I'm drawing on a piece of paper, but this is the easiest way I can think of to explain it. Let's take speech for an example. A speaking voice is very dynamic. Some words are loud and the rest are much softer. The softer words are going to be difficult to hear, especially if mixed on top of a bed of music. So I'm going to arbitrarily assign a value of 10 to the peak words and a value of 2 to the softer words. The dynamic range in this case is 8, which is 10 minus 2. Let's apply some compression at a ratio of 2 to 1. A 2 to 1 ratio basically divides each value by 2. So 10 divided by 2 is 5, and 2 divided by 2 is 1. So now our peak words are at 5, and our softer words are at 1. Next, we add what we call makeup gain. Since compression is gain reduction, gain must be added after the compression process in order to compensate for the gain that's lost. So gain is completely additive. Across the board, let's add a value of 5. So 5 plus 5 equals 10, which is where our peaks were before. 1 plus 5 equals 6. We started with an original dynamic range of 8, and now we have 4. Now the softer words can be heard on top of a bed of music, for example. 4 to 1 compression reduces the dynamic range even more. 10 divided by 4 equals 2.5. 2 divided by 4 equals 0.5. In order to return the peaks to 10, we add 7.5 as makeup gain to both values. That gives us 10 and 8. Rendering a new dynamic range of 2. There are 2 basic uses for compression, individual stems and on the master bus. Let's start with an individual stem. This is a demo session that's already been mixed, with the exception of one stem that could use compression. It's from the Tina Guo Acoustic Cello Legato Library. It's a solo, and like a solo vocal, they can sometimes benefit from some compression. In this case, the peaks of Tina's stem are heard over the mix, but the soft parts are getting buried. It's likely the composer's intention is for this part to switch from accompaniment to melody, but let's assume for this example that we want more presence from the entire part. So let's use a compressor to reduce the dynamic range. This compressor is considered a soft knee compressor. Another feature often found on compressors is a variation between soft and hard knee. In soft knee compression, as the gain increases to approach the threshold, the gain reduction increases. In this example, the threshold is -6 dB. At and above that threshold, a soft knee compressor reduces the gain at the set ratio, 2:1 for example. At half the threshold, in this case -12 dB, soft knee compression reduces the gain at a ratio of 1.5:1. And half of that, at -18 dB, the ratio is 1.25:1. In hard knee compression, absolutely zero gain reduction occurs until the gain reaches the threshold. So in this case, below the -6 dB threshold, zero compression takes place, or a 1:1 ratio. At and above the threshold, 2:1 compression is happening. Limiters are essentially compressors using hard knee compression at an infinity to 1 ratio, meaning zero gain is allowed above the threshold. Let's break away to talk a little bit about the master bus. A typical master chain of plugins begin with EQ, compression, followed by a digital limiter. The only one of these that's really necessary is the limiter. It acts as a normalizer to bring the overall level of the piece up equally. It also prevents peaks from going over the digital ceiling of 0 dB. When used too much, it can also remove dynamics and the life of a mix. A little bit gives a lot of benefit. If you're using a heavy amount of EQ on the master, chances are something's wrong inside your mix. So I suggest you bypass the master EQ and find the stem or stems causing the problem in your mix before committing to a master bus EQ. Fix the problems in your mix, and then chances are you won't need the master bus EQ. So now back to the compressor. The question of whether to use the compressor on the master chain is really up to your ears. If it sounds better with it, then use it. If not, then don't. I'm going to show you how to accurately answer that question for yourself. Many compressors like to sell you on the sound because it ends up sounding louder when active versus when it's bypassed. So don't fall for that. Make the volumes equal, then decide. Find a good compressor for the master that will stay true to your mix. Most linear multiband compressors are good for that. Let's go back to the demo session. Before you add any master bus plugins, you must make sure that your mix does not go over 0 dB, but also make sure the loudest part is at or above about -6 dB. If it's over 0 dB, you're going to be mastering a digitally distorted sound. The master bus should always be at 0 dB. If your loudest part goes over 0 dB, do not lower the master bus. The individual tracks are combining to exceed 0 dB. Lowering the master bus simply lowers the output of that distortion. Prevent the distortion by grouping all tracks in your mix and lowering their volume collectively. If you have volume automation on any track, highlight all tracks and lower them together. So give your plugins some headroom to work. I'm going to add the Waves Lin MB, their linear multiband compressor, to the master bus. I like to start with the basic multi preset. I'll bring down the threshold to about -17 or enough to create gain reduction that sits right in the middle of the range during the loudest part of your track. Now I'll bypass and unbypass. Notice the typical increase in loudness when it's active. Again, don't be fooled by that. Set the gain so that the bypass matches the active state in apparent loudness during an average section. Then listen to the track AB bypassed active. If it feels better, use it. If not, just remove it and let the limiter do the work. In this case, I hear a little bit more high end added. That's because there's more energy in the low and mid frequencies that cause the compressor to reduce the gain in those bands. So an easy fix for that is just simply lowering the output of the two high frequency bands. Set that to your taste. No matter what compressor you use, the procedure to set them is pretty similar. Whether you keep the EQ or the compressor, you must add a limiter. A super simple yet clean one to use is the Waves L2. First set the output ceiling to -0.5 dB. This prevents other DAWs and video editing software from showing levels over 0 dB. Every platform has its own interpretation of audio levels. Then bring down the threshold so that the loudest part of your mix causes about 2 dB of gain reduction. Bypass and activate. You'll notice a significant increase in gain. Your track is now as loud as it can be without audible distortion. The Waves L3 Multi-Maximizer takes more CPU, but it can sound better on some tracks. And you just follow the same steps. With the limiter on now, let's see if the compressor adds any value to the mix. I'll bypass and activate. I hope this has helped you understand a basic concept of compression and how best to determine if it works for you in your mix. Look out for more tutorial videos coming up.